Thank you, Wendy, for that generous introduction, and good afternoon, Your Excellencies, dear friends and colleagues. And thank you to International IDEA and the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for creating a space this afternoon for us to have a meaningful discussion on deliberative democracy and climate change. I'm especially grateful to my co-panelists who are generously sharing their time and insights with us today. And my gratitude also goes to Nicole Curato, Mia Stewart, and Olive Mendoza, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event happen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land where I work and live. I am a diasporic settler in Canberra, the land of the Ngunnawal people. And the work that we do in the center builds on over 65,000 years of indigenous knowledge systems. And we are grateful to learn from the traditional custodians of this land as we advance our work on deliberation and the environment. Now, deliberative democracy and climate change are two topics that are very close to my heart. Just last week, my home country, the Philippines, was once again submerged by severe tropical storm Trami, locally known as Typhoon Christine. The storm left at least 85 dead and dozens missing. On broadsheets and social media, many Filipinos have rejected the patronizing rhetoric of resilience. We are tired of being praised for surviving difficult situations in the absence of long-term sustainable solutions. What we need, as this viral image suggests, is not resilience, but accountability. Those in power must be held responsible to prevent these tragedies from recurring. And I fully support this call. But beyond demanding accountability, I argue that climate-vulnerable countries like the Philippines need impactful public deliberation on the climate and disaster policies that shape our lives. See, the problems we face today are so complex that we cannot afford to leave climate policy making and implementation in the hands of experts, government agencies, and politicians alone. Instead, we need to amplify the voices of everyday people to realize the transformative power of deliberative democracy in fragile settings. And the challenge is to create mechanisms for these voices to be heard and taken seriously. What do I mean by this? I've been working on deliberative democracy for the past 15 years. In my work, I consider deliberative democracy as a political aspiration and as a political project. As a political aspiration, deliberative democracy envisions a society where collective decisions are made based on inclusive, informed, and reflective exchange of reasons. And of course, I'm the first to admit that our world today is so far from this ideal. For many countries, patronage, nepotism, corporate greed drive policymaking instead of evidence and the pursuit of the common good. Meanwhile, our information ecosystem is a minefield of distractions. Clickbait headlines hijack our attention, while quality information sits behind paywalls. So many of you may be asking, is deliberative democracy just a naive political fantasy? The answer is no. Deliberative democracy is not a naive political fantasy. This is why we need to appreciate it as a political project that offers a practical vision for building a better collective life based on inclusive, informed, and reflective exchange of reasons. As a professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, the part of my job that I cherish the most is meeting communities around the world that advance democratic practices, that celebrate rather than eradicate our differences, and in so doing, craft decisions that are sensitive to different perspectives and experiences. In my fieldwork in the Philippines, I've seen everyday people, fishermen, market vendors, housewives, shopkeepers. I've seen them collaborate with community organizers to rebuild after losing everything to the world's strongest storm. Together, they raised 1.1 million euros through philanthropic funding to secure 12 hectares of land, now home to over 500 housing units. I had the privilege of observing them deliberate on everything, from choosing building materials and renewable energy options to deciding the paint color of their homes. So obviously the answer is orange. They tackled difficult issues that even government agencies struggle with, such as establishing fair standards for selecting beneficiaries of the homes. Some argued that only those who participated in deliberations should receive the homes, while others believe that everyone in the community, especially the elderly or mothers unable to attend long meetings, should be included. And through their deliberations, they did more than build climate-resilient homes. They created a self-governing community in a climate-challenged world. And this initiative operated outside the state's official agenda of relocating coastal communities to the mountains. They asserted their right to the city, refusing to live in residential ghettos, quote unquote, that the government built on the outskirts of the city. There are many examples of deliberative democracy in action around the world. A Muslim youth leader from the Philippines once told me that his community has practiced deliberative democracy for a long time. Academics just gave it a name. And we don't need to introduce deliberative democracy to the global south. It has deep roots, for example, in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, where consensus-based decision-making, rather than majority rule, was used to maintain peace, form trade agreements, and manage shared resources in multicultural societies. In India, the 73rd Amendment institutionalized village assemblies, allowing every adult citizen to participate in deliberations on issues affecting their lives. And while these village assemblies, of course, face challenges, one unintended function they serve is exposing inconsistencies between government climate policies with local realities. So for example, and this is an example from the book Oral Democracy. For example, in one assembly, villagers questioned the state's priority of greening villages and banning tree cutting. Public land for building homes had become inaccessible due to tree preservation laws. So when the village secretary reminded the community to plant trees in front of their homes for the government's environmental campaign, a villager humorously responded, "There's no place to build a house, where should we plant the trees?" Her fellow villagers laughed, illustrating how humor and dialogue can challenge and highlight gaps in government policy. But deliberative democracy isn't just about criticism. It helps build institutions. Porto Alegre in Brazil is the birthplace of participatory budgeting, which, in its overly simplified definition, empowers citizens to deliberate and decide on how part of the government's budget is spent. And to assess the climate impact of such a deliberative institution, it's important to take a long view. And Porto Alegre's experience is telling. Initially, citizens prioritized immediate needs like paving streets, improving housing, water, and sanitation. By 2002, these priorities led to near universal access to treated water, doubled the sewer network, and developed one of the world's best solid waste management systems, which emerged in collaboration with the citizens and the Scavengers Association. Porto Alegre also improved its environmental conditions, becoming one of Brazil's greenest cities, with 30% of its area dedicated to green space, and a third of that protected to sustain biodiversity. And this shows the power of long-term citizen deliberation embedded in government decision-making. And so in recent years, climate-sensitive participatory budgeting has gained traction as a tool to address climate impacts. None of the examples I told you are perfect, and that's the point. Just as we continue to invest in elections despite their imperfections, we must keep investing time and resources in deeply embedded practices of citizen deliberation in the global south. And the questions for us to consider include, how can we better support local governments to act as honest brokers of deliberation between citizens, policymakers, government agencies, and civil society groups? What skills do NGOs, activists, religious, village leaders, and yes, even TikTok influencers need to model deliberative behavior? And how can we maximize existing mechanisms for citizen participation to advance deliberation? There's so much work to be done in this area. In the past decade, there has been an interesting plot twist in the story of deliberative democracy, and that is the increasing popularity of citizens' assemblies. They are described as the flavor of the month in citizen engagement, as one colleague put it. A deliberative wave is taking place around the world, according to the OECD. So what are citizens' assemblies, and how are they different from the examples I mentioned earlier? Two design features set them apart. First, Participants are randomly selected everyday people reflecting the diversity of society. A citizens' assembly typically includes equal number of men and women from various age groups, regions, languages, education levels, and attitude or views towards the topic of deliberation, such as climate change. Why is that important? Because, at least for advocates of citizen assemblies, the problem with public consultations is that they always attract the same groups. And so random selection, at least in theory, corrects this by inviting people who don't typically participate in politics. Second, citizens' assemblies are designed to filter or distill a range of views and evidence before making collective recommendations. So unlike surveys or focus groups, citizens' assemblies have access to experts who can support their deliberations and facilitators who enforce norms of open-minded deliberations in group discussions. And typically, the outcome of a climate or citizens' assembly is a collective statement or a set of recommendations handed over to the authority that commissioned the process, with the next steps depending on the context. So, you may be asking, are citizens' assemblies a game changer in climate policy? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that, but let me share with you the theory of change of citizens' assemblies as far as I understand the literature. And this is the theory of change. By bringing together a diverse group of everyday, ordinary people, we hear the judgment of citizens not captured by corporate interests or politicians whose decisions are constrained by short-term electoral cycles. And empirical data shows that not only are everyday citizens competent deliberators, the judgment of everyday citizens about what to do with a climate crisis is usually ahead of politicians. What this means is that citizens' assemblies give a boost to politicians or policymakers who want to take more decisive steps to address the climate crisis. And they can cite the citizens' assembly as an impartial body of everyday people who want to take far more ambitious measures than what is currently on the table. So let me just give you one example. The paradigmatic example of a citizens' assembly is the French Convention on the Climate, which President Macron convened in response to the Yellow Vest protests in 2019. So over 6 months, 150 randomly selected citizens listened to experts, deliberated in small groups, and proposed recommendations on how to reduce France's carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. The assembly gained a lot of traction because its recommendations informed climate policy in France, such as banning short-haul flights. A study by the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies found that 20% of the Assembly's recommendations were fully implemented and 51% were modified. However, the Assembly was also controversial. President Macron vetoed some of the most radical proposals, including a proposal to make ecocide, or the intentional destruction of ecosystems, a crime, stating that, and I quote, what 150 citizens have written is not the Bible. Therefore, he shouldn't necessarily follow it. In 2021, I, along with my colleagues at the Global Citizens Assembly Network, witnessed 100 randomly selected individuals, a waitress from Brazil, a student from China, a former humanitarian worker from Syria, deliberate for 68 hours to craft the People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth, presented at COP26 in Glasgow. And the Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Emergency shows the power of putting everyday people in charge of climate policy. One key lesson: ordinary citizens are willing to push for more radical climate policies than most state actors. For instance, like the case of France, the Assembly proposed making ecocide a crime as well. Now, there are an increasing number of climate assemblies taking place in the Global South. Later, I will invite my colleague, Friedel Markart, to describe the character of these climate assemblies, who funds them, who runs them, what are their impacts. Friedel did the research, ask her all the questions. But there are examples that we can look at. Resurgentes, for example, is the first region-wide climate assembly in Latin America, which includes Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. My colleagues from Colombia, Felipe Rey and Indira Latorre, wrote about this in the report. Meanwhile, my colleague Musra Al-Masri wrote a case study on an activist-led citizens' assembly on electricity and energy justice in Lebanon. And the main lesson here is that the impact of a citizens' assembly goes beyond influencing state institutions, especially when authoritarian governments refuse to listen. So the Citizens' Assembly in Lebanon actually sparked new political ideas, highlighting the community's role in reaching a plausible energy mix rather than a tech and corporate-driven solution to the energy crisis. So, in conclusion, what is the potential of climate assemblies in the Global South? I want to conclude with two reflections. First, we must ask, who is pushing for citizens' assemblies in the Global South? Activists from the region are clear about their demands: repayment of the global North's climate debt, ending corporate influence in climate talks, and radical cuts on emissions. Would our resources be better spent amplifying the voices of deliberative Democrats in the Global South, supporting how they want to structure global deliberations, and ensuring their demands gain more traction in global governance? Can citizens' assemblies enhance a more just North-South dialogue on climate justice? Second, citizens' assemblies, I argue, are only valuable if they adopt a global ethos. While flourishing in Europe, I think their impact is questionable if their recommendations to, for example, promote green energy, if that recommendation still exploits labor and resources from the Global South, such as cobalt mining in Congo for electric vehicles. So I think these innovations must reflect our shared interconnected politics, driving inclusive and just change. Because without these global ethos, I think we just risk replicating the same power structures that have caused today's unequal climate-challenged world. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.